She died owing £4 million. Let that sink in for a moment. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, beloved icon, smiling matriarch, the most dangerous woman in Europe according to Adolf Hitler, spent nearly a century living off royal wealth and ended her life massively in debt. How does someone born into a multimillionaire aristocratic family in 1900, who married into the British royal family in 1923, who inherited £250,000 from her father, plus King George VI untaxed fortune in 1952, end up £4 million in the red? The answer reveals the real Queen Mother, an extravagant Edwardian grande dame who kept the central heating running year-round at her Scottish castle even when she wasn't there, who owned so many designer clothes they spilled out of her dressing rooms into corridors at Clarence House, who spent fortunes on race horses and was still planning horse breeding schedules out to 2003 when she was 99 years old. But the financial excess is just the beginning of this story. Because behind that gracious smile and those floating summery frocks was a woman who promoted her grandson's marriage to a naive 19-year-old despite warnings it would fail, then turned viciously against that girl when the marriage collapsed, all while lending her Scottish home to her grandson and his married mistress for their secret affair. This is the hidden story of how one charming, politically incorrect, ultra-conservative woman controlled the British royal family for nearly a century and left a trail of broken marriages, betrayed confidences, and unresolved resentments that nearly destroyed the monarchy she claimed to protect. And it starts with a marriage she never wanted in the first place. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was born on August 4th, 1900, into one of Scotland's grandest aristocratic families. Her father, the 14th Earl of Strathmore, descended from King Robert II of Scotland, inherited a small fortune in 1904, making him a multimillionaire by today's standards. They owned Glamis Castle, one of Scotland's most impressive ancient buildings, plus several other castles and a huge house in London's St. James's Square. Elizabeth's father didn't think much of the royal family. His own aristocratic lineage was older and arguably more prestigious than the upstart House of Windsor. So when Prince Albert, known as Bertie, started pursuing his daughter, the Earl wasn't especially impressed. Bertie fell for Elizabeth's exceptional charms at a Mayfair ball in 1920 and wrote to a friend, "My dream has at last been realized. It seems so marvelous to know that my darling Elizabeth will one day be my wife." But Elizabeth didn't share his enthusiasm. She refused his proposal. Then she refused him again. She didn't want to be caught in what she called the royal cage, the restricted life that marrying into the royal family would mean. She was used to her independence, and frankly, she had better options. The handsome James Stuart, son of the Earl of Moray, who'd returned from World War I with the Military Cross, was far more appealing. But Queen Mary and Elizabeth's mother had other plans. They saw James Stuart as an obstacle and essentially exiled him to the oil fields of Oklahoma to get him out of the way. Bertie kept asking. He was persistent. You have to give him that. He asked her 3 times total. And finally, whether from pressure, duty, or genuine affection, Elizabeth agreed. On April 26, 1923, she married the Duke of York in Westminster Abbey. She was 23 years old. She stepped onto that famous Buckingham Palace balcony for the first time as Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York, entitled to curtsies and royal tributes, and she would spend the next 79 years never letting anyone forget it. The marriage transformed both their lives, but in ways neither expected. Bertie had been terrified of his father, King George V, who believed fear should govern his children. The king once said, "I was terrified of my father, and I'm gonna make bloody sure my children are afraid of me." All the royal children suffered from digestive troubles, a sign of extreme nervousness under their father's tyrannical parenting. Bertie had a severe stammer that made public speaking torture. He had crowd phobia. He was shy, reserved, nervous, and according to friends, should have been in a monastery. But Elizabeth gave him stability, a happy home, two daughters, Elizabeth, born in 1926, and Margaret in 1930, and the confidence to function in public life. She knew exactly how to handle him, how to bring out his strengths while hiding his weaknesses. When he'd lose his temper, she'd teasingly take his pulse, saying tick, 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 tick to make him laugh at himself. She was the strength where he had weakness. And she would need every ounce of that strength, because in 1936, everything changed. King George V died in January 1936, and his eldest son David became King Edward VIII. David had been carrying on a scandalous relationship with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee in her second marriage. The British press kept it quiet, but the royal family knew. Elizabeth, the Duchess of York, strongly disapproved of David's lifestyle and particularly despised Wallis Simpson. There was one famous incident when David, now king, gave a dinner party at Balmoral where Wallis behaved like the hostess, coming forward to welcome guests. Elizabeth walked right past her, saying, "I've come to have dinner with a king," and completely ignored Wallis. The animosity was mutual. Wallis called Elizabeth's daughters snippy little princesses. Elizabeth called Wallis hard, shiny, cold, everything she found vulgar about Americans. When David announced in December 1936 that he was abdicating the throne to marry the woman I love, Elizabeth's world collapsed. Her husband Bertie would become king, and Bertie was absolutely terrified. He burst into tears when he realized what was happening, crying on his mother, Queen Mary's shoulder. He went around muttering about being a lamb to the slaughter. He was totally unprepared, completely untrained, never expected to be king. He had an ulcer, a stammer, was highly nervous. The coronation was set for May 12th, 1937, same date. Different king, as Bertie sardonically noted. On coronation day, he looked ghost white under the heavy white satin robe embroidered with empire emblems. But something changed after the ceremony. He suddenly acquired regal poise, and beside him, Elizabeth rose to her new responsibilities as queen. But she never forgave David and Wallis for what they'd done to her husband. She blamed them for destroying Bertie's health, for forcing him into a role that would eventually kill him, and she would spend the next 60-plus years making sure everyone knew it. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as David and Wallis were now called, were exiled to France. David assumed it was temporary, that he'd be welcomed back to Britain soon. He was wrong. That exile would last until his death in 1972, 36 years later, and the Queen Mother made damn sure he stayed exiled. The war years transformed Elizabeth from decorative duchess into propaganda weapon. When Buckingham Palace was bombed in 1940, she famously said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the face." Hitler called her the most dangerous woman in Europe because he thought she had King George VI under her thumb, that she was the real power behind the throne. He wasn't entirely wrong. Elizabeth was stronger, more socially adept, better at public relations than her nervous husband. She knew how to work a crowd. She knew what to wear. Norman Hartnell created 30 white outfits for a state visit to Paris in 1938 that absolutely took France by storm. Every single outfit was white after her mother died, and she had to wear mourning white dresses, white parasols, white gloves, white shoes, everything white. The French went insane. France has lost its heart. It has a new queen, they declared. Headlines proclaimed, "We have taken the queen to our hearts. France is a monarchy again." During the war, Elizabeth visited wounded soldiers constantly, joined knitting campaigns, made sure she always looked her best, because as she said, if poor people were coming to see me, they would certainly look their best, and I shall look my best for them. Hats became her trademark. She had to be visible to the public. She incorporated war effort emblems like Royal Air Force wings into her hat designs. But here's what most people don't know. She claimed she only got normal rations, but actually received far more clothing coupons than ordinary citizens. The royal family maintained their privileged lifestyle even during wartime austerity. They had ration books for show, but the reality was different. King George VI was a heavy smoker and drinker. Elizabeth didn't try very hard to stop him. The whiskey decanter got a good, hearty swig every evening, especially at regimental dinners. The smoking was destroying his health, but she didn't push back. Maybe she didn't realize how bad it was. Or maybe she just didn't want to fight that battle. When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, the exhausted king and queen appeared on the Buckingham Palace balcony with Winston Churchill to deafening cheers. They'd survived. Britain had survived. The monarchy had survived. But the cost to Bertie was catastrophic. The strain of war, combined with his heavy smoking and underlying anxiety, had wrecked his body. In 1948, they celebrated their silver wedding anniversary. Bertie, only 53, was already showing symptoms of his final illness. He bravely made a speech thanking people for their goodwill, but he looked terrible. He'd lost massive amounts of weight. Friends could see he was dying. On February 6th, 1952, just 6 days after Princess Elizabeth flew to Kenya on his behalf, King George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham. He was 57 years old. Elizabeth was 51, suddenly a widow after 29 years of marriage. At his funeral, the coffin was covered with a wreath bearing the message "Darling Bertie" from his loving Elizabeth. Walking behind the coffin was David, the Duke of Windsor, whose abdication had forced the crown onto his brother. Wallis wasn't invited to the funeral. She was never accepted as family, and the Queen Mother would make sure that never changed. This is where the real Queen Mother story begins, because widowhood gave her 50 more years to exercise control over the royal family without the moderating influence of a husband, and she used that power ruthlessly. Her first target was her own daughter. Princess Margaret had fallen in love with group captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man who'd been King George VI's equerry. After the king's death, Townsend was working for the Queen Mother at her new home, Clarence House. He was divorced from his wife and now free to marry Margaret. But there was a problem. The Church of England didn't permit divorced people to remarry. And Margaret, as sister to the Queen and fourth in line to the throne, needed permission. The Queen Mother simply turned her back on the whole situation. She put it out of her mind, one of her great secrets of tremendous tranquility, as friends described it. She didn't let things bother her by pretending they didn't exist. Margaret was determined to marry Townsend, but the establishment, including her own mother, applied subtle pressure until Margaret finally gave up. She announced she wouldn't marry him because of her Christian faith and sense of royal duty. The truth was simpler. The Queen Mother didn't want scandal. She had her eye on history, wanted to be remembered as above reproach, and couldn't be associated with a divorced man marrying into the family. Never mind that this stance was completely hypocritical given what she'd later enable for her grandson Charles. When Margaret finally married photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, the Queen Mother was delighted. He was artistic, fun, had taste. She adored him. Even after he and Margaret divorced 18 years later, the Queen Mother continued entertaining him as though nothing had happened, which infuriated Margaret. The Queen Mother's loyalty wasn't to her daughter, it was to appearances, to maintaining the image of royal perfection. But nowhere was her manipulation more devastating than in her role promoting the marriage of Prince Charles to Lady Diana Spencer. Charles was the Queen Mother's favorite, the grandson who became the son she never had after she realized at 47 she'd never have a boy of her own. Charles was vulnerable, like Bertie had been sent away to Gordonstown boarding school, where he was bullied and miserable. He'd escaped to the Queen Mother's Scottish home Birkhall, where she'd encourage him, support his artistic interests, cherish him in ways his conventional parents didn't. She saw in him the same vulnerability her husband had had. And when it came time for Charles to marry, she had opinions about who would be suitable. Diana was perfect on paper. 19 years old, from an aristocratic family with royal connections, grew up on the Sandringham estate, a virgin with no past boyfriends to cause scandal. The marriage was quietly promoted by the Queen Mother. according to sources. She told Charles, "You're not to mess her about. If you don't grab her, somebody else will, because she's so attractive." Here's where it gets really dark. Diana's grandmother was Lady Ruth Fermoy, the Queen Mother's longtime lady-in-waiting and constant companion. Ruth Fermoy had testified against her own daughter in a custody battle years earlier, helping Diana's father win custody of the children, including Diana. She put duty to the royal family above her own family. And when Charles and Diana's engagement was announced, Ruth Fermoy reportedly had doubts it was a good idea. But as one source explained, you have to understand how courtiers are. They don't tell the boss anything the boss might not want to hear. However much she may have said, "Oh God," afterwards, I don't think she went along and said to the royal family, "I'm not sure this is going to be a good idea." So the marriage went forward, and when it started falling apart, the Queen Mother's loyalty remained entirely with Charles, while Ruth Fermoy abandoned her own granddaughter to support him. Lady Fermoy died in 1993. The Queen Mother attended the funeral as final honor for the courtier who'd put royalty before family and let down both her daughter and granddaughter. But perhaps influenced by Ruth Fermoy, the Queen Mother came to see Diana as frivolous, with little sense of duty. And that brings us to the most shocking revelation of all. While Diana's marriage to Charles collapsed in public affairs, exposed, eating disorders revealed, separation announced the Queen Mother wasn't just supporting Charles emotionally. She was actively enabling his adultery with Camilla Parker Bowles. Birkhall, the Queen Mother's house on the Balmoral estate in Scotland, was made available for Charles and Camilla's secret meetings, always with the Queen Mother's knowledge and permission. Prince Charles is a dutiful grandson, sources explained. He knows everything about keeping in touch with the Queen Mother, letting her know what's going on. And in return, the Queen Mother, rather enjoying the secret nature of this relationship between Charles and the adulterous Mrs. Parker Bowles, was quite prepared to smile on it and lend her house to them. Read that again. The Queen Mother, who'd spent 60 years blaming Wallis Simpson for destroying her husband's marriage to the throne, who'd kept the Duke and Duchess of Windsor in exile for decades, who'd turned her back on Princess Margaret's love for a divorced man, was actively facilitating her married grandson's affair with a married woman. The hypocrisy is staggering. But it gets worse. The Queen Mother's close friendship with the Parker Bowles family went back decades. Derek Parker Bowles, Andrew Parker Bowles' father, was one of her closest friends. She'd known Camilla since Camilla was young. So when Prince Charles needed somewhere to conduct his affair away from prying eyes, Granny's Scottish house was perfect. Meanwhile, Diana was publicly condemned for every misstep. When Diana started pushing back, cooperating with Andrew Morton's biography, giving the Panorama interview where she said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," the Queen Mother's animosity intensified. The Queen Mother could never really work out how Diana could do it and get away with it, one source explained. The more Diana did and the more Diana got away with it, the bigger the breach between them. It's my belief that Diana absolutely hated the Queen Mother. Think about Diana's position. She was 19 when she married Charles. Her grandmother, Ruth Fermoy, had promoted the match despite private doubts. The Queen Mother had encouraged it. Then, when Charles's lifelong affair with Camilla continued through the marriage, Diana was expected to shut up and suffer in silence like a proper royal wife. When she refused, when she fought back by going public, the entire royal establishment, including her own grandmother, turned against her. And the Queen Mother, the supposedly beloved matriarch, was one of Diana's harshest critics. She became angry with Diana because she saw the havoc Diana was wreaking with the monarchy, which is something the Queen Mother had given duty to all her life, sources confirmed. But the havoc Diana was wreaking was just telling the truth about how the royal family had treated her. The Queen Mother belonged to a generation that believed royal secrets should stay secret, that the family should present a united and smiling facade to the public. Diana and Charles's messy public divorce violated everything the Queen Mother stood for. So she sided with Charles completely, blamed Diana for everything, and continued lending Burkhall for Charles and Camilla's affair. When Diana died in August 1997, the question hanging over everything was, how much responsibility did the royal family, including the Queen Mother, bear for driving Diana to that point? But let's step back from the Diana tragedy for a moment and look at the Queen Mother's own lifestyle, because the financial excess is its own scandal. Remember, she died owing £4 million. How does that happen? King George VI didn't pay income tax. The monarchy had arranged that they wouldn't, so the vast fortune they'd inherited and the properties they owned just kept building up, untaxed. They had wonderful financial advice, and a great fortune accumulated. Elizabeth, having always had as much money as she wanted, never learned to economize. She simply spent and spent and spent. She loved clothes, jewelry, luxurious living, and especially horse racing. She owned race horses, an extraordinarily expensive hobby, and at 99 years old was still planning horse breeding schedules with her racing manager up to 2003. I think she intends to be around for a while yet, friends joked. She loved Ascot races, loved national hunt racing, spent fortunes on it. Her racing habits alone cost hundreds of thousands of pounds annually. Then there were the properties. After Bertie died, Elizabeth bought the Castle of Mai on the northern tip of Scotland, a derelict castle she saw, and said, "I'm having it." It became a symbol of her restoration to life after widowhood. She spent fortunes restoring it, making it her holiday home. But here's the kicker. She kept the central heating running year-round at the Castle of Mai, even when she wasn't there. The bills were colossal. The royal family, who had to pick up her bills, slightly worried about this extravagance, but she insisted the heating had to stay on so the woodwork wouldn't contract and damp stains wouldn't appear. At Clarence House, her London home, she had so many designer clothes on racks in polythene bags that they'd spilled out along corridors. She would not throw anything away. Norman Hartnell and his successor continued making her elaborate couture gowns until the end of his life. Every outfit was a production: floating panels, ostrich feathers, pearls, jewels, high-heeled shoes. When she went to Venice in 1984, she brought elaborate outfits for every occasion. She told friends the only regret she had as she grew older was that things do not matter so strongly, but clearly her wardrobe still mattered plenty. She loved entertaining at Clarence House, inviting people for what she called little picnics in her garden, which turned out to be lavish affairs, with silver and gold plate on tables, footmen behind every chair, finest wines and champagne served. That, to her, is a picnic, sources noted. Her Olympian view about money was simple. It's there, and it's there to be spent, and life is to be lived, and money helps. She didn't concern herself with budgets or restraint. The Queen would occasionally lob her odd amounts of money to cover debts, probably saying, "Not another new dress, mummy?" But the Queen Mother would insist, "I have to dress up for them, don't I?" 5 years before her death, the Queen Mother put £19 million in trust, mostly for her great-grandchildren, $4.9 million each to Princes William and Harry when they turned 21, another $8 million to be shared when they turned 40. This was a strategic move to avoid inheritance tax. So the reason she may not have had a lot of money at the end was because it had been shunted aside for tax purposes. But that doesn't explain the £4 million overdraft. That came from pure extravagance: the clothes, the racing, the properties, the lifestyle of an Edwardian grande dame living a century past her era. She was living in a different age, and she refused to adapt. She had more servants than any other royal family member. She entertained like it was 1920 rather than 2000, and nobody could tell her no. The Queen Mother's iron control over the family extended beyond just Charles and Diana. She was the linchpin of the royal family throughout the last 100 years, the continuity, always there, smiling and waving. But that control came with costs. She'd prevented Princess Margaret from marrying Peter Townsend, then watched Margaret's eventual marriage to Tony Snowdon fall apart, after 18 years. She'd promoted Charles and Diana's doomed match, then blamed Diana when it exploded. She'd enabled Charles and Camilla's affair while maintaining her public image as devoted grandmother. And through it all, she never admitted fault, never acknowledged mistakes, never took responsibility for the wreckage left behind. Friends described her ability to cast off worries and maintain tremendous tranquility by simply not letting things bother her. Translation, she ignored problems she'd created until they became someone else's crisis. Her relationship with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, her exiled brother-in-law, and his wife exemplified this cold ruthlessness. For 36 years after his abdication, David lived in France with Wallis, still hoping to be welcomed back to Britain. The Queen Mother made sure that never happened. She blamed David for forcing the kingship on Bertie, for shortening his life through the stress of unexpected coronation and wartime responsibilities. Some sources say she certainly had a certain amount of influence in keeping the Duke of Windsor out of England. She mistakenly believed that he would attract people and would make her husband seem dull in comparison. When David died in May 1972 at age 77, he was finally allowed to be buried in royal ground at Frogmore near Windsor Castle, but Wallis still wasn't accepted as family. The Queen Mother never forgave, never forgot. She'd maintained that grudge for 36 years until David's death, and she'd maintain it against Wallis for another 14 years until Wallis died in 1986. The pattern was clear. The Queen Mother's loyalty was to the institution of monarchy and her own position within it, not to individuals. When Princess Margaret needed support for her relationship with Peter Townsend, the Queen Mother turned away to avoid scandal. When Diana needed help navigating royal life, the Queen Mother sided with Charles and family tradition. When her own lavish lifestyle threatened to bankrupt her, she simply kept spending and let the Queen cover the bills. She was a tremendous help to King George VI, but not the power behind the throne, though Hitler had believed she was, and honestly, Hitler might have been right. She'd shaped British monarchy for a century, influenced major royal marriages, enabled affairs, excluded family members, and maintained an iron grip on royal protocol and public image. And she'd done it all while presenting herself as the sweet, smiling, flower-loving grandmother in floating frocks and elaborate hats. But behind that carefully constructed image was someone much harder. Privately, she is ultra-conservative and very politically incorrect, the documentary admits. Born in the Edwardian era, she remained an Edwardian for her entire life. Class-conscious, extravagant, believing deeply in hierarchy and duty, as long as the duty was someone else's. She could exercise control by her very presence, and her natural charm and elegance shines through on camera, but that charm masked ruthless calculation. When she needed to manipulate outcomes, she did so while maintaining plausible deniability. When marriages she'd promoted failed, she blamed the victims. When her spending spiraled out of control, she simply expected others to cover it. She was, in many ways, the ultimate royal survivor, but her survival came at tremendous cost to those around her. The Queen Mother belonged to a generation that found it very hard to accept that so many of her grandchildren had unhappy marriages and did not say, "This is my duty, I'm going to put up with it." But she failed to recognize her own role in creating those unhappy marriages through manipulation, favoritism, and rigid adherence to outdated social codes. She wanted her family to present a united and smiling facade, while she enabled the affairs and betrayals that made that facade impossible to maintain. When Diana and Charles washed their dirty linen in public, the Queen Mother was horrified, not because the marriage had failed, but because they'd admitted it had failed. Appearances mattered more than reality. Image mattered more than truth. And institutional preservation mattered more than individual happiness. Those were the Queen Mother's values, and she never wavered from them, even as the world changed around her. After her death, royal observers predicted there will be a lot of trimming down of the monarchy. The Queen has preferred to wait as long as Mummy's alive, leave things as they are. The Queen Mother represented the old order, the Edwardian extravagance, the unwavering hierarchy that couldn't adapt to modern expectations of transparency and accountability. She was the linchpin, yes, but she was also the anchor holding the monarchy in the past. Her century of influence shaped British royalty in ways both inspiring and destructive. She helped the monarchy survive abdication and world war, but she also helped create the dysfunction, favoritism, and rigid protocol that nearly destroyed it in the next generation. She was charming and cruel, gracious and manipulative, devoted and self-serving, all at once. And she died as she'd lived, in debt but unapologetic, surrounded by luxury but lonely at the core, beloved by millions who never knew the woman behind the smile. So here's my final question for you. Was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the savior of British monarchy, or its most successful manipulator? Did her century of service justify the £4 million debt, the broken marriages she promoted, the affairs she enabled, the family members she exiled? History remembers her as the smiling grandmother in floating frocks, but now you know the truth about the iron will, cold calculation, and ruthless loyalty to institution over individuals that defined her real legacy. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear whether you think she saved the monarchy or nearly destroyed it through her manipulations. And if this video exposed truths about the Queen Mother that the official histories won't touch, subscribe to Crown and Secrets and share this with someone who still believes the fairy tale version. Because the real story of the most dangerous woman in Europe deserves to be told. Thanks for watching Crown and Secrets, and I'll see you in the next one, where we continue exposing the secrets behind those palace walls.